Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jonathan Ahl. With the Better Together proposal that had sought to consolidate much of St. Louis city and county government now no longer up for consideration, what's next for our region, especially when it comes to addressing racial equity issues? Focus St. Louis is asking this question and much more at a free event sponsored by the organization tomorrow night at 5:30 in the Missouri History Museum, titled Equity in City-County Reform, Political Representation, and Criminal Justice. The gathering will bring together a variety of speakers from both the city and county. Currently, more than 275 people are already registered. Some of those involved with the event also join me now in the studio: St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell, Cristina Garmendia, who is the author of St. Louis Equity Indicators Baseline Report that was released earlier this year. She's also a staff member at Washington University's Race and Opportunity Lab at the Brown School, and Wally Siewert, Director of Civic Engagement and the Impact Fellows Program for Focus St. Louis. Wesley, Cristina, and Wally, thank you all for being here today to talk about this.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
We will talk a little bit directly about the event tomorrow night in just a second, but Wesley Bell, I have a couple of questions for you that are related to this. First, Kim Gardner's having a news conference tomorrow about the grand jury investigation into her office, and many of her supporters say that investigation was racially motivated, and I think that's a very relevant issue to what Focus St. Louis is talking about. Do you think that the investigation into your counterpart's office was racially motivated?
As you all know, I've been in office 6 months, and so we've been focused on getting our office and implementing the reforms that we were voted in to implement, and so that's been our focus. And what I will say is that I know I support Kim. We need to support our regional leaders. And so that's a tough job, and as I've seen, 6 months in, and so but our focus has been on St. Louis County and getting this office going in the right direction.
Do you think that the concerns about the investigating being racially motivated, do you think that takes a step back from some of the things that you're trying to accomplish? For the region, not just you specifically, but in the region, and the idea that we want to make sure that there's a criminal justice system that is fair to all people. Do you think that this investigation is a distraction or steps back from that or moves further away from that?
Well, I think that anytime that you see a situation like this, it's not going to be beneficial to the region. Having said that, as many know, there's a gag order in place, and so we're limited in the information that we know. I know that's something that the circuit attorney has been vocal about, wanting to be able to speak about it. But as a result, I don't know all of the details of it. But in the meantime, we want that office to do well, because when that office does well, the region benefits.
Now, another issue that was big with you, that I know is taking a lot of your time and attention right now, was the 5 people who were killed over the weekend in North County. You've charged 2 men with that crime. Not to get specifics into that case per se, but how do you feel this multiple homicide reflects on the efforts to reduce violent crime in the county and accomplish some of the things that you've wanted to accomplish with public safety?
Well, I think that we talked about this. I've talked about this for the last 1.5 to 2 years and longer, is that we need to comprehensively address socioeconomic, racial issues and lack of equity, because when we talk about public safety, all of these things are related. And so I would borrow from Dr. Siewert, is that we need to focus on the process, and the process includes bringing all of our community partners together, because if you just want to see crime reduced and you want to put it on the shoulders of law enforcement as well as the prosecutor's office, there are things that we can do. But are we going to get the best outcome, the most effective outcome, is when we get everyone involved, our public entities, our stakeholders, in education, with jobs and job training, organizations like Urban League, and so many organizations across this region that are jumping in the fray to address this problem. So I think what we saw over the weekend is symptomatic of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed.
Perfect way to transition into, let's talk about talking, because the event tomorrow night seems to be very much focused on having open dialogue and discussion, something that arguably didn't happen with the Better Together program, or at least did not happen to the satisfaction of a lot of people that ended up not having any buy-in. My question for whomever would like to start is, what's going to be different? How do you have that discussion? How do you have that community-wide discussion into this so that everybody feels like their voices are heard, even if what they have to say doesn't end up being in a final plan or path forward?
The point about voices being heard is really important. Right? Democracy works because every single citizen has this vague belief in the back of their head that no matter what decision gets made, at some point in the process, their point of view had its 5 minutes at the table, right? So that's what we're hoping to do, and the reason this is different from from the Better Together effort is we're not putting forward a plan. We don't have a stake in exactly how this is done. Instead, we want to ask questions. We want to determine what are the questions we need to ask of any plan that comes forward, because this is something the region still needs to address. So bringing in the folks that are working on the ground on these issues, and opening it up to conversation from the community before anybody decides what a plan should look like, I think is that right step of taking 10 steps back before we move forward again.
Now, I don't want to the Better Together plan is a dead horse, and there's no point for us to beat it here today. But Better Together said that same thing. They said that they had community forums. They claimed that voices were heard, but then when their plan came to the table, many people, especially people of color and in minority communities, said, no, our voices were not heard. So what do you all learn from that to make it different this time?
I think the important point is allowing people into the room and allowing them to be heard and getting down to the nitty-gritty of the issues. Just as a for instance, I went to a lot of those forums before the Better Together plan was released, and none of the controversial details of the plan were ever discussed. No one talked about dissolving St. Louis City into unincorporated St. Louis County until the plan was actually rolled out, with the language ready to go to the Secretary of State. So you don't create language and roll it out ready to go to the Secretary of State without having talked about that language and then call it a community process. Now, I give Better Together a lot of credit for having brought the region to a point where we're talking about this again seriously for the first time in decades. But I think there's a better process to be had.
Cristina, let's talk about the report that you put together, your findings, what you found in it, and how data can inform a process that is highly emotional and personal.
Yeah, so I was brought in on a grant-funded position at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I was embedded in the mayor's office for just over a year and the task I was given was to identify metrics. So to identify ways to measure progress or lack of progress towards achieving racial equity across a really wide scope of issues. And so part of the process I applied was talking to department heads to understand what metrics do they use today, how do they measure success, and how can we embed racial equity in a way that makes sense for them to achieve their goals. So that was the type of approach I tried to take to really take the Ferguson Commission's work to the next level to help. I think it is a challenge for people to know what does it mean to have a racial equity lens and what does it mean for my work. And so that was part of my task, was to really bring language to create just a standard set of data for across the city around those issues.
A good friend of mine once said, data isn't good or evil, it's what you do with it that matters. Mm-hmm. And Sarah on our St. Louis on the Air Facebook page has this question. As a community, how can we use the data from your report to make a change?
Yes. So data is only good if you actually use it to hold people accountable. And so one way to hold people accountable is to ask them to make reforms to reduce racial disparities in the areas that matter to them. And then I think one downside of my report is that there's only one report. It's a baseline report, so it's designed to be measured again so we can see whether the interventions that we're doing, the reforms that we're making, are actually making an impact on reducing racial disparities. And so that is critical. You need that data to even hold institutions and leaders accountable for what they're responsible for doing.
I'd like to broach the subject of law enforcement because one of the things that was, at least it appeared to be enticing about Better Together, was the idea that some kind of consolidated police force throughout the county could standardize practices and procedures, make it more fair, make a situation where people had more trust in law enforcement, and there weren't a number of small police forces that may have felt disconnected from the communities that they were charged with protecting. Wesley, can you maybe speak to, do you still think that's possible? Do you still think that's a good idea? Or is part of what you want to know whether the average person walking on the street in St. Louis or Florissant or Ferguson would see that as a benefit?
You know, what I'll say is, in law school, one of the best pieces of advice I was given was, don't skip steps. And this is to Christina's point, as well as Dr. Siewert, is that we have to make sure that we're including the community engagement component of anything that you're going to do. And as a quick anecdote, Veneta Park and Veneta Terrace were the first two cities to voluntarily merge in St. Louis County. There was not a plan that was forced down voters' throats. They put a plan together with public input. They sold the plan, and then they put it up for vote. And the voters decided to do this. And so with the police departments, same thing. Philosophically, it sounds like a great idea. The problem is that most communities think that consolidation is good, just not in my community. And so what we have to do is we have to make sure that we're not skipping steps. If there is a plan that we're going to put in place, we need to make sure that there's input on the front end, as Dr. Siewert said, that there's plenty of opportunity for discussion and cross-examination of any plan, and then put something out there that voters can actually make a determination about. And so I think that we can't start from the end and work our way backwards. We have to start with the community engagement and see where our residents want to go.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue with this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jonathan Ahl. Now back to our conversation with St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell, Cristina Garmendia, author of the St. Louis Equity Indicators Baseline Report, and Wally Siewert with Focus St. Louis. We're talking about getting buy-in and not having a plan ahead of time and getting the buy-in first. People can be skeptical, especially after what I think is generally considered a fiasco of Better Together. What would you say to someone, any of you would say to somebody, say, they really have a plan. They're just holding these public hearings to see if what we say goes along with the plan that they're waiting to release before they hear what we say. How would you deal with that skepticism and questioning?
You know, I would say people can sniff out inauthenticity fairly quickly. And in my previous life, if you will, as a Ferguson City Councilman, that was one of the things that we realized was an issue, was that people did not feel that that their voices were being heard from leadership, from different governmental entities. And so myself and others, Ella Jones being one person that I work closely with, we set up a different events where we could talk to people in small groups, large groups, be it town halls, be it small group meetings, what have you, and listened. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that we did, we called our listening circles, so that we didn't have any plan to put forth. We didn't have any agenda. We just wanted to hear from the community. And so if you're doing it from an authentic place, people will know. But again, as my two counterparts know, there's still going to be people who will question it. But I think that you have to, if you're going forth in a good faith manner, people will see.
I think that's a really strong point about people being able to ferret out inauthenticity relatively quickly. And one of the ways to think about it, when the Ferguson Commission first started, the first couple of meetings of the Ferguson Commission were awful. I mean, they were people screaming and yelling, getting up, rushing the stage. They were really terrible. And the commission was kind of willing, didn't have much choice, but was also kind of willing to sit there and listen. And eventually, once people understood that their anger was being heard and was getting out there, things calmed down and they got to a productive conversation.
Well, then maybe it wasn't terrible. Did that need to happen? Do we need to have tomorrow night, while I'm sure it's going to be a civil and very well-run organization, do you need to let people yell and scream a little bit if that's what it is necessary to get people's ideas out there?
If you want to do authentic community engagement, get comfortable with discomfort. There's just no way around it. There's no question about that.
So is Focus St. Louis, is Focus St. Louis going to take the lead on something?
No. What Focus St. Louis thinks of itself as an organization that likes to create a good leadership ecosystem here in the region. And that includes creating community conversations where we can play the role of neutral convener. And that's really important to us. We're not coming to the stage with a plan. We're not coming to the stage with an agenda. We want to be the space where people who might not otherwise be able to come together and talk will know that they're going to have a conversation that is relevant and gets into the real issues, but also framed well so that everyone can stay at the table. We're not papering over the issues in the interests of some kind of false civility, but we're also hopefully having that conversation in a way that's productive.
Just to add, if that's okay,
yeah, please,
Jonathan,
please do.
As a graduate of the Focus St. Louis and the great work that they do, I think it's important that understanding that process, that there is a role for everyone. And everyone's role is not going to be identical. And I think Focus St. Louis does a great job of facilitating a lot of conversations and bringing resources together. And that talking component that we talked about before, as Abraham Lincoln said, if you give me 4 hours to cut a tree, I'm going to take 3 hours sharpening the axe. And I think that that's important. And I think the role the void that they feel is so important as we look to resource map, to look at all of the different resources that we have available so we can help bring effective solutions.
But if the main failing of Better Together was that there was a lack of meaningful dialogue and open communication, and the one organization that seems to be more dedicated to that, isn't there some obligation for you to not just do part one, but see it to part two? Because if not you, then whom? And how can you trust those people to build on what you do? Isn't there some obligation to step into the void, not just the void of people not having the conversation, but the void of people putting together a plan that actually has buy-in?
Well, I appreciate that you want to give Focus St. Louis this much kind of ability to make change in the region, but that's not really our role. What I want to point out—
Could it be?
We don't want to step into into it being our policy that's moving forward. There's a constitutional process that's going to be happening right now.
It wouldn't be your policy if you do this convening the way that you say that you're going to, and you really do have all voices heard, and what you come up with at the end of whatever process you do is a real understanding of how people think. Who better than Focus St. Louis than to say, okay, here's what people say, here's a plan.
But Jonathan,
I'll tell you who better, the Board of Freeholders.
I got to say, Jonathan, and I appreciate the comments, but you're doing exactly what we're talking about. You're telling them what they should be doing, as opposed to understanding this is their role, and they do a good job with that role. But also, to your point, this is a huge undertaking. And so it's going to take a lot of discussion. It's going to take a lot of organizations getting involved and focus, St. Louis being one of many. But I think you make an excellent point.
Well, I'm just my point is that if you are relying on someone in some political office or someone else to do that, isn't there a huge risk of all the data that you've collected, all the conversations that you have, be completely ignored by someone who puts together a proposal for political purposes, and then it ends up in the same place that Better Together did?
If you hand over political power to others, there is always a risk that everything you wanted to have happen will get lost. But handing over political power to others is part of what being a community process is all about. And there's a constitutional process currently underway to create a board of freeholders from the county and from the city to look at this process. They are the appropriate legal authority to consider this. Now, what I hope is that this conversation, and if we have more, informs the questions that are asked of that board of freeholders. Hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're answering the questions that the community has and the concerns that the community has. For instance, to talk about Cristina's equity indicators report for a moment, some really interesting data in there about where in the process of folks coming in and applying for a police officer job and becoming a police officer, we're losing all of our African American candidates. So once we understand that, we can bring pointed questions to the process of how a new police department might look.
Christina, can you go into that data a little bit more and maybe other examples that your data might lead to something that would be part of a proposal from somebody someday?
Before I do that, I do want to mention, one huge gap, I think, in the St. Louis ecosystem is watchdog organizations, people that are able to hold institutions accountable. And the biggest elephant in the room is that the current watchdog in this room is you, the press. And
we're on it.
So I think there is a gap. I mean, the work I did on the Equity Indicators report does not have a new home. It's awkward for a mayor's office to be undertaking its own accountability work. And I think the new home for such this type of work to continue it, to do the next report, and actually all those reforms that Wesley Bell proposed, did those work? It can't come from within his own office, right? So I think there does need to be an outside body that has, and I think it's really hard to be neutral on these issues. So it's hard for a lot of the institutions that currently exist in St. Louis that pride themselves on their neutrality to take on that role, and that includes the universities.
So if the mayor and the county executive appoint the board of freeholders, is the mayor and the county executive going to be there tomorrow night?
Not that I know.
That seems to be a problem.
It's relatively rare that elected executives will insert themselves into a community conversation that someone else is setting up, that someone else is centering, that someone else is setting the agenda for. So I didn't expect them. What I do expect is that when that board of freeholders is appointed, and it's not just the mayor and the executive, by the way, the legislative bodies in both arms get a say as well. What I do expect and hope is that the questions that we ask are brought to bear on who it is that sits on that board of freeholders.
And ultimately, it's not you're encouraging the people to hold their elected officials responsible for what the community conversation entails.
Yes.
To try to, and we could talk about this for 3 hours, but to try to make sure there's a really important point I want to make sure that we get to. One of the critical reasons why Better Together did not succeed was that the African American community felt disenfranchised, ignored, and that the proposal was something that would dramatically reduce their representation and political influence. Do you think that can be avoided in the future, and what role does a community conversation have in making sure that minority communities feel like they are part of the driving force of what it looks like? Because I think seat at the table is probably even patronizing. I mean, part of like being part of the driving force of making this happen.
I think that when we talk about making sure people's voices are heard in this particular conversation, African Americans, I think having those difficult conversations, and not just window dressing, but actual conversations, whether it be finding people where they are, whether it is going to barbershops, whether it's conducting town hall meetings, or what have you. There are ways that we can have these conversations, and we've seen it with record turnouts in St. Louis County, particularly in North County in 2018. But what I think the biggest issue with Better Together was the idea that the state should be voting, or the state should be voting on a St. Louis issue. That's like if Missouri decides to change its constitution, we have a nationwide vote. That would be ridiculous. And so the non-starter, and I think we can even go before go before this issue, is that St. Louis County and St. Louis City residents should be the ones making the decision. And if you're doing that from a place of authenticity, then African Americans and minorities will have that seat at the table and be able to participate in those discussions. But once you start bringing others into a place where they shouldn't, where it's not appropriate for them, for example, again, a statewide vote, that's when you start running into problems of disenfranchisement and these questions that you're talking about.
So you think it was more about the fact that, I'm here from Rolla, that someone from Rolla would have a vote on this? That was a bigger issue than some of the issues of representation and who the county executive, who would be running the show and how they'd be. You think that was a bigger issue?
I think we got to eat and chew gum. I think both of them. We got to eat and chew gum at the same time. These are both. It's a non-starter to allow. And again, my son's in Rolla at the University of Missouri S&T, but Rolla, Missourians from Rolla shouldn't be voting on what we do in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. But in addition to that, we did have issues with minority communities, African American communities, not getting their fair say and being heard in this process.
The event that Focus St. Louis is hosting is tomorrow night at 5:30. It is Equity in City-County Reform, Political Representation, and Criminal Justice. It's at the Missouri History Museum, again, tomorrow night at 5:30. I'd like very much to thank our guests for being on the program with us. St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell, Cristina Garmendia, the author of the St. Louis Equity Indicators Baseline Report, and Wally Siewert with Focus St. Louis. Thank you all very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.